Well, good morning. It's great to be at Defend. I love coming. I love bringing groups. Bob has experienced our home because he's been there. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story about Bob that, Dr. Stewart, sorry, that I love telling just because it's funny and it's about my kids. So he was at OBU, and I always try to plug him into as many classes. I have him guest lecture, I have him give blurbs for NOBTS, I have him do public lectures. You know, if he's going to come, I want to just make him do as much as he's willing to do. And so by the end of one day, he was just plumb tired, and we were going to have supper at my house. So he comes over, we're going to have dinner, and he's like, "Is it okay if I just sit and rest for a bit?" And I'm like, yeah, that's okay. And he promptly falls asleep in our easy chair. And my kids come home from school, and my middle daughter, Alethea, she comes home from school, and she's like, "Who's that?" I'm like, "Shh, that's Dr. Stewart. He's sleeping, he's tired." "Who's Dr. Stewart?" I'm like, "He's famous." And she's like, "No, he's not. Like, he's just your friend." I'm like, no, like, he's really famous." She's like, "No, he's not." So she goes and she looks him up on Google. And she comes back about 3 minutes later, and she's like, "Dad, he's famous. He's written books. He's in our house." And she was just thrilled. And we were just thrilled. I mean, I was as giddy as Alethea was. I just didn't want to let her know that I was as giddy as she was about having Bob Stewart in our home. This is, in my estimation, the best apologetics conference in North America, bar none. I've been to a lot of conferences like Bob. I don't have as good a taste in conferences as he does. And I've been to a lot of apologetics conferences, and this is the best one. And it happens on a yearly basis. And he puts it together. And I just appreciate all of the work that Bob and his team do. I know there's a lot of people behind it. It's not just a one-person show. But I'm so grateful to them for their investment in the kingdom of God, in the next generation of students and of adults that want to become equipped to share their faith with others. This week has been incredible. You've learned a lot. I've learned a lot. You've already heard from three of like my heroes in apologetics, right? Like Gary Habermas, Tim McGrew, Craig Hazen, and then here I am. So let me thank you and commend you all for taking time out of your busy lives, your busy schedules to come and to learn and to become equipped. I hope and trust that there will be something helpful for you this morning as well. Somebody asked me about my name. Actually, more than one person asked me about my name. It's a little bit unusual. I hear that frequently. I'm a man with an identity crisis. Okay, so my name is Tawa. It's like a recovery group, right? Hi, my name is Tawa. And most people don't really understand what that name is a North American Indian name. Okay, so I have a native name, and people say, "Oh," and then you can see them kind of process in their mind, "You don't look very native. Should I ask the question, or would that be insulting?" And like, "No, I'm not native. I'm Swedish. Okay, I'm Swedish Canadian." And so like, "Okay, so you're Swedish Canadian with a native name. How does that come about?" And I'm like, "Well, you got to understand, right? My parents were hippies in the 60s, right? And I'm the youngest of 4 kids. You start to run out of good names by the time you get to the 4th kid, right? And so one night they'd been up way too late, probably smoking things they shouldn't have been smoking. And they're like, "Okay, what are we going to name this kid? You know, my mom's pregnant, 8 months pregnant. Like, what are we going to do?" So they're like, "Okay, I know what we'll do. We'll just draw letters out of a hat, and whatever comes out, we'll do something with it." Well, you get 2 A's, a W, and a T, and your options are pretty limited, right? Wata. No, that's not going to be good. How about a what? Well, that might make good sense. A what? What is? So Ta was kind of all that's left, right, to be able to do with that. But no, it's a Native American name. And it got more confusing because I was Swedish Canadian, Native American name, and then God calls me to pastor in a Chinese church. So I'm in a Chinese church in Canada that's Southern Baptist, as a Swedish Canadian with a native name. Who am I? I don't know. And then God brings me to Oklahoma, which is like Native America. And so now I'm a Swedish Canadian with a Native American name who pastored in a Chinese church, and I'm in Oklahoma. And so it's just profoundly odd. Incidentally, my hometown, Edmonton, Alberta, it is currently about minus 25 degrees. I think it hit 75 here yesterday. So, you know, it's only about 100 degrees colder where I come from than it is here. Quite appropriately, our topic this morning is the problem of evil, speaking of 25 below zero. It's also appropriate that the problem of evil is being talked about at 8:30 in the morning on a Thursday of a week-long conference, right? It can be hard to get up that Thursday morning. And so again, I commend you all. Well, it's hard maybe for some of you. I'm an early bird, right? So it's not quite so hard for us early birds, but we do feel your pain, if only in a vicarious and mocking fashion. I guess you could say we're early mockingbirds, right? My primary contention this morning is very, very simple. I guess I need to use this, don't I? There we go. An acknowledgement of real evil in the world serves as an argument for, not against, the existence of God. Okay, it's frequently thought and argued that evil and suffering tends to undermine Christianity. My thesis is the opposite, that the existence of evil supports a Christian worldview. Now, my primary focus is going to be the existence of evil within the Christianity naturalism debate. That's where I want to zero in. But I think my contention holds more broadly as well. And to set up the discussion, we want to engage two preliminary matters. First, an articulation of the reality of evil, and second, identifying evil as a universal worldview problem. Now, we've provided a handout that has both an outline on the front and then many blanks to fill in. All right, I'm hopeful that this will keep you interested and active and engaged as the argument proceeds. And if making paper airplanes or origami with your handouts fulfills that purpose equally well, I heartily endorse that course of action. If you did not get a handout, put your hands up and they will get you one. Okay, so if you didn't get a handout, or if you want an extra one to make paper airplanes, put your hand up and they will get you one. I do want to emphasize, like everything that you're doing this week, this is going to be somewhat of a surface level treatment. We're going to cover a lot of ground in not as much depth as it can be covered. So there's lots more that can be said about everything that I want to say. Father God, we thank you for the opportunity we have again this morning to come, to set aside time to learn, to grow. Lord, I pray that we will learn about you, learn to love you more with heart and mind and soul and strength. And Lord, I just pray that the meditations of my heart and the words of my mouth would be pleasing in your sight. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So first, what do we mean by evil? If we're going to engage the so-called problem of evil, we better first have a handle on what it is that we are talking about. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines evil as morally reprehensible or causing harm. Dictionary.com, that always reliable source, articulates evil as an adjective as morally wrong or bad, harmful, injurious, or wicked. As a noun, evil is the wicked or immoral part of someone or something. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy distinguishes broad evil from a narrow concept of evil. In its broad sense, evil is any bad state of affairs, wrongful action, or character flaw. In its narrow sense, evil picks out only the most morally despicable sorts of actions, characters, and events. We need to keep these definitions in mind as we go throughout this morning. Now, both broad and narrow evils can be either moral or natural in origin. Moral evil results from the intentions or negligence of moral agents, while natural evil is bad states of affairs which occur independently of any actions or lack thereof of moral agents. Our primary focus will be upon moral evil, but again, I think the contentions that I'm going to make will carry for natural evil as well. So taking these definitions as a whole then, evil I'm going to call the occurrence of bad or negative states of affairs due to wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. Now, arriving at philosophical definitions of evil can be very contentious, but even if someone wants to nitpick on the definition of evil, I think we can still recognize evil in its occurrences. A famous Chicago judge once declared, "I may not be able to define pornography, but I know it when I see it, and that's it." So too with evil. Maybe somebody says we can't adequately define evil, but we can sure recognize it when we see it. The late comedian and atheist George Carlin writes this: "I got to tell you," actually he says this, and then it's written down, "the longer you live, the more you look around, the more you realize something is wrong here. War, disease, death, destruction, hunger, filth, poverty, torture, crime, corruption, the ice capades. Something is definitely wrong." Or take this anecdote from the atheistic neuroscientist Sam Harris. Imagine you're a young widow who's lived her entire life in the midst of civil war. Today, your 7-year-old daughter was raped and dismembered before your eyes. Worse still, the perpetrator was your 14-year-old son, who was goaded to this evil at the point of a machete by a press gang of drug-addled soldiers. You are now running barefoot through the jungle with killers in pursuit. I trust that we can move forward with an understanding that yes, evil is a reality. Whether it's the ice capades or sadistic tribal wars or the Crimson Tide or 8 a.m. college classes or widespread poverty or the Holocaust of abortion or fake news or Texas, we can acknowledge the reality of bad or negative states of affairs. Did I say Texas out loud? I'm sorry, that was supposed to stay in there. The reality of bad or negative states of affairs due to wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. So again, we may not agree 100% on what specific things count as evil or suffering, but we will acknowledge the reality of evil and suffering. And our agreement on the existence of evil and suffering is the critical starting point to any discussion about evil in general or the problem of evil in particular. And it leads to the second preliminary point that must be established. Evil is a universal worldview problem. That is, all worldviews, not just Christianity, have to cope with and respond to the reality of evil in the world. A worldview, broadly stated, is the conceptual lens through which we see, understand, and interpret the world and our place within it. Worldviews can be theistic or non-theistic, religious or non-religious, but all worldviews must deal with the reality of evil. And there's 3 prongs to this point. First, all worldviews acknowledge the existence and or experience of evil and suffering. Even worldviews that might reject or at least question the objective reality of evil, Hinduism with its notion of Maya, or Buddhism or Christian Science, they nonetheless embrace the personal experience of evil. Secondly, all worldviews recognize that evil is not the way that things ought to be, that there's something amiss in the universe. The brilliant French mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal noted the ubiquitous human feeling that something in the universe is wrong, a sentiment that is present not only in religious worldviews like Christianity that affirm a prehistoric fall that explains the evil in the world, but every human civilization and worldview. Pascal writes, "Who indeed would think himself unhappy not to be a king, except one who had been dispossessed? Who would think himself unhappy if he had only one mouth? Who would not be if he had only one eye? It has probably never occurred to anyone to be distressed at not having 3 eyes, but those who have none are inconsolable." Humans all, Pascal notes, have the impression that things are not the way that they once were, and not the way that they ought to be. And so third, as a result, all worldviews must account for the existence or experience of evil and suffering. That is, as I argue in Introduction to Christian Worldview, all worldviews have to answer the core worldview question, what is our problem? So Buddhism, for example, holds in its 4 noble truths that suffering is caused by desire or craving, and that ultimately is an illusion. That's not the way reality is. Islam holds that evil and suffering are the result of humans' refusal to submit to Allah's straight path. Christianity holds that evil and suffering are the result of the fallen state of creation. Hinduism, in some forms, holds that evil and suffering don't exist, but the experience of evil is the result of being confused as to the true state of reality. The point here again is simply to note that evil and suffering pose a universal worldview problem. In circles of Christian philosophy and apologetics, we frequently hear mention of the problem of evil, referencing the thought that evil and suffering in the world pose a specific challenge to the truthfulness of Christianity. We'll deal with that contention, and we have to, but in the moment we must acknowledge that evil and suffering pose a problem not just for Christianity, but for all worldviews. All right, so 2 preliminary things, right? First, evil can be defined as bad or negative states of affairs due to wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. Second, the existence and or experience of evil is a universal worldview problem, a fact that must be accounted for by any worldview that claims to be an adequate representation of reality. Now I want to narrow our focus and consider the existence of evil in the context of the Christian atheist debate. I want to zero in on 2 specific contending worldviews that I think are the most prominent in our society: Orthodox Christian theism and atheism, or secular humanism or philosophical naturalism. My basic question is this: which worldview, Christianity or atheism, best accounts for the existence and experience of evil and suffering in the world? My contention will be that while atheists frequently offer the problem of evil as evidence that God doesn't exist, the contrary argument is much stronger. That is, evil and suffering serve as evidence for, not against, the existence of God and the truthfulness of Christianity. So traditionally, the problem of evil has been instrumental as an arrow in the quiver of philosophical atheists. Again, the late comedian George Carlin, this is packed around either side of the quote I read from him earlier. He says, when it comes to believing in God, I really tried. I really tried. I tried to believe that there is a God who created each of us in his own image and likeness, who loves us very much and keeps a close eye on things. I tried to believe that, but I gotta tell you, the longer you live, the more you look around, the more you realize something is wrong here. This is not good work. If this is the best God can do, I am not impressed. Results like these do not belong on the resume of a supreme being. This is the kind of blankety blank you'd expect from an office temp with a bad attitude. Similarly, America's most widely read agnostic, the biblical scholar and former evangelical Christian Bart Ehrman, states this: I came to a point where I could no longer believe. I realized that I could no longer reconcile the claims of faith with the facts of life. In particular, I could no longer explain how there can be a good and all-powerful God actively involved in this world, given the state of things. For many people who inhabit this world, life is a cesspool of misery and suffering. I came to a point where I simply could not believe that there is a good and kindly disposed ruler who is in charge of it. Evil and suffering, then, historically pose a challenge to Christian faith. There's three families or three versions of the atheist's problem of evil: logical, evidential, and existential versions. I want to look at these briefly in turn, along with some elementary Christian responses to them. Now, many of you will have attended one or more of the excellent breakout sessions on the problem of evil by really smart people like Ray Stewart or Steve Lemke, the provost here at NOBTS. And they will have gone into more detail on some of the aspects of what I'm going to cover in the next 20 minutes or so. But in this section, again, my argument wants to be that the atheist's arguments against God from evil fail. That is, there is no successful problem of evil that demonstrates that God does not, or probably does not, exist. And I want to start with the logical problem of evil, which makes the strong claim that, given the existence of God, of Christianity, there should be no evil in the world. Given that there clearly is evil, then it follows that God must not exist. And the oldest version of the argument is given to us by the Greek philosopher Epicurus. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent but impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent, not benevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? The 18th century Scottish skeptic David Hume revived Epicurus' objection against God. And the logical problem of evil for him argues that God and evil are not logically consistent. The short form of the propositional argument is a simple modus tollens structure. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. If God exists, then there would be no evil. Evil exists, that is, it is false that evil does not exist, therefore God does not exist. It's a valid argument form, but a valid argument is only as good as the premises that support the conclusion. With Hume's argument, the immediate problem is the first premise. Why would one argue that God and evil are logically incompatible? Why presume that if God exists, then evil cannot? Hume never really made the connection clear. He just presumed that his readers would be immediately persuaded that the premise is true. The 20th century atheist J.L. Mackie, however, realized that there is no logical connection in Hume's version, but nonetheless, Mackie was convinced that the logical version is sound, is valid in form, and has true premises when it's constructed rightly. So he endeavored to establish the truth of Hume's first premise. Accordingly, he's got a logical version of the problem of evil that's a bit more sophisticated and makes the connection between God and evil explicit. I believe this logical form is on the back of your handout. So premise one, if God exists, then he is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Now, why, if that kind of God exists, would there be no evil? Here's the work that Mackie does to flesh it out. An omnipotent being has the ability to prevent evil. An omniscient being has the knowledge of how to prevent evil. An omnibenevolent being has the desire to prevent evil. Therefore, if God exists, there would be no evil. There is evil, therefore God does not exist. Well, now we've got a more rigorous form of the logical problem of evil to work with. And it is strong in its claim, right? Epicurus, Hume, and Mackie believe that the very existence of evil disproves the existence of the Christian God. Given evil, it is logically impossible for the God of Christianity to exist. So it's not just that, as a matter of fact, God doesn't exist. It's as a matter of principle, God actually cannot exist. So let's examine the argument and see why it does not successfully show what Mackie wants it to. Now, premise one, seems to be clearly true, regardless of one's worldview orientation. Whether or not God actually does exist, these seem to be necessary attributes of a divine being: omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. Incidentally, we were talking about the ontological argument yesterday. It's quite independently helpful that here Mackey not only grants but utilizes the first premise in the traditional ontological argument. Because I think then everything else follows, so I think Mackey's got himself trapped anyways. Furthermore, if premises 2 through 4 are true, premise 5 seems to clearly follow from them, right? That marks, I think, the important work that Mackey has done here. Premise 6 seems to be clearly true. I have no desire, at least, to suggest that evil and suffering are merely illusions. And premises 5 through 7 form, again, a simple modus tollens argument. If premises 5 and 6 are true, then premise 7 follows necessarily. If, then, there are problems with Mackey's argument, the problems have to surround premises 2 through 4. And indeed, that's where we find the problem. I got to see, where are we? There we are. There's where I want to be. The problems have to surround premises 2 through 4. So let's start then with premise 4, which reads, an omnibenevolent being has the desire to prevent evil. And I think Christians will generally grant that God does have a desire to prevent evil, all other things being equal. The question is, are all other things equal? Is there anything else worth considering? Now first, as the prophet Isaiah reminds us, and we'll come back to this, God's ways are not our ways, nor are his thoughts our thoughts. Perhaps it might be better if we affirm instead that an omnibenevolent being has the prima facie desire to prevent evil. Okay? That is, before considering the facts, all other things being equal, God has a desire to prevent evil. But might there be something that overrides this prima facie desire? Well, I think certainly there are, and I'll give you 2 suggestions. First, perhaps God is accomplishing some greater good through the evils that he permits to occur. So, Cowan and Spiegel argue that God allows evil in order to bring about some greater good, a good which could not be brought about unless evil existed as its precondition. So some good outcomes, perhaps, can only be achieved by permitting a degree of evil to occur. Now, we can find support for that line of thinking in common human experience, right? I like to tell the story about the first time that we took my son to get shots, right? So in Canada, you take your kids at 3 months to get their first round of shots. And so our oldest son, he's now 17. He's like y'all's age for some of y'all. Go to college next year. He's a senior in high school this year. But I remember taking him at 3 months old to get his shots. So, they asked both mom and dad to come, and this is our first child. This is kind of an exciting thing, right? We're taking pictures on the way out the door, and we go to the community health clinic, and we go in there, and we see, nice, friendly young nurse, and she's like, oh, hi, how are you? Oh, what's his name? Oh, Mateo, how are you? She tinkles a little toy in front of his face, and, sitting down in the room, and she says, okay, now, Dad, sit there and hold Mateo and hold him really close, and I'm like, oh, I love to hug and love my son, so I'm cuddling my son, and she's like, all right, now, hold him close, and she's tinkling this little toy, and then she jabs him in the arm with a needle. Bam! What's the next thing that happens? Usually people say, oh, well, your son screamed. Right? That's the next thing that happens, right? No, it's not the next thing that happened. Before that happened in glorious display. But before that, my son, who I'm holding tightly, turned around and looked up at me. With words that I could see as plain as day, Dad, I thought you loved me. The first words I hear from my son, he doesn't really say them, just utter betrayal. Dad, I thought you loved me, and you allowed the stranger to stab me with a sharp object and cause me this pain and suffering. Why, oh why would you do this? Well, why would I do this? For his good, right? There's a greater good that's being accomplished. I do have a general rule of thumb as a parent. I think most parents here will have this. Raise your hands and say amen if you have this rule of thumb. Don't allow strangers to stab your children in the arm with sharp objects. Do I get an amen? Right? It's a general rule of thumb, right? Okay. Now, that's a prima facie desire that I have as a parent. So if I'm walking down the street and I see Lainey coming towards us with a sharp object in her arm, I'm going to, right? I'm going to go hockey on you. Right, I'm not going to let that happen. But there's something when we go to the community health clinic, an ultima facie desire that overrides the prima facie desire such that I allow this stranger to stab my son in the arm with a sharp object. Those are the kind of traumatic events that I don't think children ever really overcome. What Christians believe occurred on Good Friday, by the same token, is an appalling evil. The unjust conviction, torture, and execution of Jesus of Nazareth. Have you ever thought that Christians really are a sadistic bunch? We're like, oh, hey, yeah, this guy, he was a really good guy, and the Romans arrested him, and then they put a crown of thorns on his head, and they beat him up, and they smacked him, and they called him names, and they spit on him, and they stripped him naked, and nailed him to a cross, and he died. Let's call this day Good Friday. What's wrong with it? No, okay, why do we call it Good Friday? Because of the good that is accomplished through it. That could only be accomplished through the evil. Is it an evil that occurs? Yes. Does God have a sufficient reason for permitting this evil to occur? Yes. So the Christian can ultimately argue that an omnibenevolent being has a morally sufficient reason to permit evil, and thus an ultima facie desire not to prevent evil, at least in all cases. Now, if it is the case that an all-loving God can have a sufficient reason to permit evil, then there is no logical inconsistency between the existence of God and the presence of evil in God's creation. This response to the logical problem of evil is known as a greater good theodicy. But there's a second path that Christians can take to the logical problem of evil, a path known as the free will defense. Perhaps the greater good that justifies God's permitting evil is a creation of significantly free creatures. Alvin Plantinga argues that a world containing creatures who are significantly free and freely perform more good than evil actions is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free will creatures at all. But, the skeptic might ask, and in fact J.L. Mackie asks exactly this question, why wouldn't God create free creatures who always choose to do good? It seems, Mackie says, that this would be logically possible for God to create such creatures. Nonetheless, Plantinga argues, even an omnipotent God cannot create just any logically possible world. After all, it seems logically possible for there to be a world in which God doesn't exist. So it would be logically possible for God to create a world in which he doesn't exist. But, Plantinga argues, even an omnipotent God couldn't create that world. Why? Because God, by definition, is a necessarily existing being. He either exists in all possible worlds or he does not exist at all. So although it's logically conceivable for God to create a world in which he doesn't exist, such a world is not actualizable. God cannot actually bring it into existence. God cannot create a world in which he doesn't exist. An omnipotent, all-powerful God still has logical limits or boundaries to his power. If he plays baseball, he can't bat higher than 1,000. He can't have a save percentage above 1,000. He can't create a square circle. He can't create a world in which he doesn't exist. It seems likely, then, Plantinga argues, that even an omnipotent God could not have created a world in which significantly free creatures always chose to do good. Why not? Because in such a scenario, these creatures would not be significantly free after all. If people never had the ability to do evil, then it would seem that they would not possess robust or libertarian freedom. Thus, the Christian argues that the skeptic's second premise, an omnipotent being has the ability to prevent evil, also needs to be refined. If God has that ability, it can only be fulfilled by not creating free-willed creatures at all, in which case we don't have a problem of evil because we don't exist. So, Plantinga suggests premise 2 prime. An omnipotent being possesses all power, but it's not logically possible to create a world with free-willed creatures who will always freely choose good. Thus, God cannot create a world with moral good, but without moral evil. Now, both of these Christian responses to the logical problem of evil, the greater good defense and the free will defense, I think successfully show that there is no logical contradiction between the existence of God and the existence of evil. God and evil can both exist without incoherence. And even skeptical philosophers generally concede, particularly that Plantinga's free will defense successfully refutes the logical problem of evil. James Beebe, atheistic professor of philosophy at the University of Buffalo, after a long discourse on Mackie and Plantinga, grudgingly grants that it seems that the free will defense successfully defeats the logical problem of evil. But the skeptic might not be done, right? So perhaps the logical presentation of the problem from evil fails, but there might be life yet for an evidential problem of evil. For example, William Rowe, atheistic philosopher, acknowledges that the existence of God is compatible with the existence of evil, but it's the type and amount of evil, Rowe says, that we experience in the world that makes God's existence highly improbable. Rowe and others believe that God's existence is inconsistent with gratuitous evil, evil that does not serve some greater good. Rowe grants the cogency of a greater good defense that God's existence is logically compatible with evil, providing that God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting the evil that occurs, but he argues that it's still likely that God does not exist. Why? Because if God exists, there would be no pointless evil, but there is pointless evil, therefore God does not exist. Another modus tollens argument form. So Rowe and others acknowledge that shots, inoculations, even Christ's crucifixion can theoretically be evils that are used to accomplish a greater good that would otherwise be unattainable. But Rowe believes there are numerous examples of evil in the world where there is no greater good being attained. A burning fawn in a forest fire is one of his famous examples. Child abuse, you can think of the passage in the Brothers Karamazov where Ivan Karamazov is berating Alyosha for what God allows. And if God allows even one child to suffer meaninglessly, Ivan says, I will never worship that God. I turn back the ticket. I will not take it. Such evil is known as gratuitous. It is evil that does not make a point, does not serve a greater purpose, does not accomplish some greater good. And gratuitous evil, Rowe argues, is incompatible with the existence of God. One of the two must go. But the Christian might ask, how can Rowe be so confident that some of the evils that occur in the world are truly pointless? After all, we can clearly see that some examples of evil or suffering are attaining a greater good that would be unattainable. Couldn't it be the case that all evil states of affairs are accomplishing a greater good? And Rowe grants that, yeah, okay, that's logically possible, but nonetheless, he thinks it's extremely unlikely. Why? Well, he invokes what's called the no-seum inference. The no-seum inference claims that I cannot see an X, or evidence of there being an X, therefore there probably is no X. Now, no-seum inferences are frequently helpful, and all of us employ them very, very regularly, right? So if I came into the auditorium screaming from the back and said, there's a hurricane outside, the wind is wild, the rain's bashing against the building, and you all looked around and you're like, I don't hear no rain, I don't see no trees falling over, y'all's wrong, right? I no see 'em, therefore I am not there. If, on the other hand, I said, there's a dust mite on my pants. And you looked at me and said, I don't see no dust mite on your pants. What are you talking about? Y'all's wrong. It's not there. Right? The first no-seum inference, perfectly legitimate, right? Why? Because if there's a hurricane outside, we'd expect to see evidence of it, yeah? Second no-seum inference, entirely invalid. Why? Because if there's a dust mite on my pants, even I wouldn't see it. Yeah? If you open your refrigerator, right, you go home, and we have a saying in my house called looking like a man. Right? So my wife sends me to look for something, and I go on to look for it, and I'm like, honey, it ain't there. Right? Well, half the time it is there. But okay, if I open my fridge, and I'm going to get a gallon of milk, right? And I'm like, okay, I don't see a gallon of milk in the fridge, therefore I conclude there's not a gallon of milk in the fridge. It's not there, right? I no see him, I'm not there. If, on the other hand, she says, there's a speck of flour in the far top corner of the fridge, and I open the fridge and I look in and I'm like, honey, I don't see it, therefore it's not there. Is that a legitimate conclusion? Well, no, because a speck of flour would be too small for me to see, right? So some no-seem inferences are valid, sometimes they're invalid. What determines it? Whether or not we should expect to see the thing that we don't see. The question for William Rowe and the evidential problem of evil, then, is whether we ought to expect to see the purpose of each and every instance of evil and suffering in the world. Stephen Weichster articulated a position that's become known as skeptical theism. Craig Hazen yesterday talked about the logic of unknowing that's very, very similar to that, where he says, you ask me, what purpose could God have in this? I don't have a clue. We could speculate, we could think, but I don't know, you don't know. This is basically the approach of skeptical theism. If God has a purpose in a particular evil that occurs, should we expect to know what that is in each and every case? Weichster argues that no, we shouldn't. Why not? Because God is all-knowing, omnipotent, and I'm itty-bitty and not. I have a little itty-bitty brain that comprehends a little itty-bitty corner of the world, and that's it. And God sees it all. Furthermore, I'm finite, and I'm fallible, and I'm fallen, none of which God is. If God is accomplishing greater goods through these evils, we should not expect to comprehend the full depth and breadth of God's reasoning. Why would we expect to understand the full range of thought of the infinite Creator God? Ought we not rather to expect that God will often be accomplishing things that we cannot even possibly comprehend, given our limited intellectual resources and temporal perspective? Now, recall again me taking my son to get his shots. Does my son have any clue what the greater good is in that situation? No, and he can't. He has insufficient knowledge and an insufficient base of experience to be able to understand what's going on. Can we understand what's going on in that situation? Yes. And that's part of being a parent, right? Is knowing what's best for your kids when your kids don't think you know what's best for them. If we know that's true in human parent-child relationships, why on earth would we expect it to be any different with a divine parent-human-child relationship? Skeptical theism, it seems to me, successfully rebuts Rowe's evidential version of the problem of evil. But can we go further? I think we can. William Rowe suggests that God and pointless evil are incompatible. I don't necessarily grant that, but let's agree with them just for the sake of argument. Grant the truth of what I have here as premise 1. If God exists, there would be no pointless evil. As a Christian, I have great confidence in the first part of that, in the antecedent. Great confidence in the existence of God. My knowledge of God's existence is based upon both general and special revelation, cosmological, teleological, moral arguments, ontological arguments, arguments from religious experience, arguments from desire, arguments from beauty, and so forth, as well as my own experiential awareness of God's reality and presence in my own life. And so I have extremely strong, rational, evidential, and experiential grounds to believe that God exists. And so if we begin with the premise, if God exists, there is no pointless evil, I've got great grounds on which to argue God exists. I certainly have more confidence in my second premise than in Rowe's second premise. But if you take my second premise, what follows from it? There is no pointless evil. So if I'm confident in the existence of God, I can accept Rowe's claim that God and pointless evil cannot coexist and yet reject his conclusion. Instead, I will be led to believe that there is no pointless evil. And in cases where I cannot see the greater good that God is accomplishing through an apparently pointless evil, there nonetheless is a greater good. So both, I think, the logical and evidential versions of the problem of evil fail. They are also both philosophical in nature. They're abstract, dealing in the realm of ideas and concepts and possibilities and necessities. And in academic literature, these are the manifestations of the problem of evil that philosophers and theologians deal with the most commonly. But in day-to-day life, I strongly believe that most of the time people's complaints about evil in the world are not abstract or philosophical, but rather deeply personal. People are Job, not Mackie. The question is not how can God coexist with evil, but rather why did God allow this in my life? Or why did God allow this specific evil in the life of people that I care about? And I think this is a very different sort of issue, and one that requires a very different sort of response. It seems to me that Bart Ehrman's problem with evil is not logical or evidential, but rather personal and experiential. He does raise and support both Mackie and Rowe's versions of the philosophical problem, but he asserts that evil is a deeply personal issue, and the dry academic reasonings of ivory tower professors is impotent and insulting. He writes, I don't know if you've read any of the writings of the modern theodicists, but there's something to behold, precise, philosophically nuanced, deeply thought out, filled with esoteric terminology and finely reasoned explanations for why suffering does not preclude the existence of a divine being of power and love. Frankly, to most of us, these writings are not just obtuse, they're disconnected from real life. Life is lived in the trenches. Many of the attempts to explain evil can, in the end, be morally repugnant. First, I think he's right. But secondly, the irony is that he builds his case against God on the rational success of the philosophical problems of evil. The philosophical objections based on evil itself, or gratuitous evil particularly. And only after doing that does he raise the existential problem and then ridicule the philosophically nuanced, deeply thought out theodicies. But the heart of Ehrman's complaint points to a reality in our treatment of the problem of evil. Most frequently, those who cite evil as a reason to disbelieve God are not raising a philosophical problem that needs a philosophical answer. They're expressing a personal or existential hurt that requires a personal and existential presence of loving compassion and concern. Personal hurt requires loving presence. And I want to drive that home, partly because it's true and necessary, but partly because I'm now going to set that aside and provide what Ehrman despises, but I nonetheless think is also necessary, an abstract philosophical response to even this existential or personal version of the problem of evil. And I want to emphasize, this is not the thing to deliver to somebody who's in the midst of hurting and crying out against God. That's what the loving presence is for. The philosophical responses are for 6 months before somebody is hurting. They're from March 2001, not September 2001. The existential problem of evil, again, states that if God exists and is all-loving, why did he allow this particular evil that hurt me or my loved ones? And I want to make 3 brief suggestions. First, soul-making theodicies. Whoop, I got ahead of myself, didn't I? Where am I? There I am. That's where we're supposed to be. I'm sorry, I got us all off track on there. Soul-making theodicies point to the impact of evil and suffering in developing virtue and character. My friend Paul Buller, who's an engineer and a theologian in Calgary, Alberta, writes that imagining a world without suffering is to him horrific in the extreme. It's a fascinating book that he writes. A lack of evil and suffering, he says, would mean that there is no opportunity to develop heroism, no need for self-sacrifice, no room for virtue, no call for work or dedication or creativity, no ability to learn perseverance. A world without evil would not, Buller suggests, be better than our current world. It would be far worse. It's interesting. John Hick, before his kind of wanderings in Birmingham into universalism and pluralism, did some wonderful work in the realm of soul-making theodicy that I highly recommend. Second, we had a Messianic Jewish rabbi once preach at my home church. It's fun, right? Having a Messianic Jewish rabbi preach in a Chinese church that's Southern Baptist. It's hilarious. We do all sorts of weird stuff there. And he said this: God is not so much interested in what happens to you, but in what you do with what happens to you. God's not concerned about the what happens to you, but what you do with it. Okay? So if you're going to suffer, how are you going to respond to it? That's God's concern. He's expressing a version of what I call an eschatological theodicy, that the things that occur in this life are transient in nature, even the evil and suffering, and of little importance compared to eternal matters. Now, that's irrelevant if eternal matters don't exist. But if eternal matters do exist, then as 2 Corinthians 4:18 says, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Third, there's no easy way to say this, but perhaps it needs to be said that our expectations for this life are just completely out of whack. I want to say this sensitively, but you can't. But these are the sorts of truths that need to be expressed. Again, to say these things to somebody in the midst of suffering is the height of insensitivity, but it remains true. Perhaps there is something profoundly wrong with a contemporary society that expects human life should be free from trials and tribulations. Why does a lifelong chain smoker curse God when she's dying of lung cancer? I can do no better on this than to quote Louis Marcos at some length. He says, why is it that the last 2 generations of Americans and Europeans, generations that have seen a vast decrease in human suffering, have struggled more with the problem of pain than all previous generations? The greater our quality of life, it seems, the more apt we are to reject God on account of the suffering in our world. How can this be? Christian Europe, he writes, accepted that the problem with man, the reason he could never build a perfect world or free himself from evil and suffering, was his inborn propensity for sin and pride and disobedience. After Rousseau, more and more people in the West distanced themselves from original sin and came to believe that man, at least in his original state, was inherently good. And because we misunderstand or refuse to accept that we are fallen, we imagine that we ourselves, apart from God, can eradicate all evil and suffering through state-run public education, universal health care, and free market capitalism. Alas, because we feel entitled to all of these things and more, we're left angry and bitter when we do not get what we think we deserve. In response to our disappointment, we do not question our Rousseauian assumptions, but we blame God for not bailing us out. When suffering occurs, our first response is to blame society, the system, our DNA, or God, rather than considering that it might be the result of our misuse of free will or a spur to test and purify our moral character and faith. So, we've looked at the atheist arguments against God from evil. The logical problem of evil suggests that an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient God is incompatible with the existence of any evil in the world. A greater good and free will defenses, I think, successfully rebut that. We looked at the evidential and experiential problems of evil, and again, in short, the range of atheist arguments against God from evil fail. Now, refuting or rebutting the atheist's objection against Christianity based on evil, I think, is a worthwhile endeavor. But I want to spend some time now looking in a different direction. I think the experience of evil and suffering is frequently used as a battering ram against the Christian faith. But I think, again, the argument works better the other way. Rather than the atheist using the problem of evil against Christian faith, I think the Christian should use the problem of evil against the naturalist. And so I want to build towards this in 6 cumulative steps. Again, my primary contention is that the existence and experience of evil, the problem of evil, is evidence for the existence of God against naturalism. So first, make sure I'm on the first. I think that's the right one. The problem of evil requires the existence of objective evil. Step 1. At the very beginning of this talk, I noted again that existence and experience of evil is a universal worldview problem, okay? All worldviews have to account for evil in the world. In order for there to be a problem with evil, however, there has to be such a thing as objective evil. Things that really are evil. Because if they're just things that we don't like, well, who cares? You can't use that as an axe against God. So the first premise, if there is no objective evil, then there is no problem of evil. Real objective evil. Recall our definitions of evil, right? Bad or negative states of affairs due to wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. Evil cannot be simply a subjective or relative matter. If it is, then there is no worldview problem with evil. This, again, I think is a very simple and straightforward premise, and I trust it doesn't need further elaboration. Second, the existence of objective evil requires that there be an objective standard for moral values and duties. For there to be a worldview problem of evil, there needs to be objective evil. For the existence of objective evil, you need to have an objective standard for moral values and duties. Hence, premise 2. If there is no such thing as objective moral values and duties, then there is no such thing as objective evil. Again, remember our definition. Bad or negative states of affairs due to the wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. Now, with our focus more narrowly on moral evil, the bad or negative states of affairs occur due to the intentions or negligence of free-willed creatures. That outcome requires that there be a set of moral values and duties that are binding upon these free-willed creatures. Think of it. If there's no objective moral values and duties, that would mean that there are no moral requirements for human beings. No set of actions that are mandatory, no set of actions that are forbidden. If there are no objective moral values and duties, then it's meaningless to say Ted Bundy ought not to have raped and murdered scores of college girls. If there's no objective moral values and duties, then it is meaningless to say ISIS fighters act wickedly when they cut off the heads of Christian civilians in Syria. We could very meaningfully say, I really hate that rapists rape, or I really wish ISIS would quit killing people, but in the absence of objective moral values and duties, we cannot hold the existence of objective evil. Now again, I think this premise is relatively straightforward and see no need to defend it further. It's the next premise where the philosophical dispute really lies. I contend that the existence of objective moral values and duties requires the existence of a transcendent personal moral creator, that is, God. Remembering again that we're narrowly focused here on the Christian atheism debate, we'll take that God to be the God of Christianity. If there is no God, my argument is that there can be no objective standard for moral values and duties. Now, the astute observer will probably realize that this premise is part of the moral argument for God's existence, popularized by C.S. Lewis, utilized, I think, to powerful effect by a lot of contemporary apologists like William Lane Craig. The fundamental insight behind this premise and behind the moral argument for God's existence is that the existence of objective moral values and duties that are binding upon all people in all places at all times is dependent upon a transcendent source for these moral truths. The only plausible candidate for such moral truths is a transcendent, personal, moral, divine being, God. If no such being exists, then there can be no such thing as objective moral values and duties. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist either. And many thoughtful atheists have admitted this to be the case. Lots disagree, and we'll get to that. But Will Provine, the late professor of history of biology at Cornell University, claimed the implications of atheistic evolution are stark but clear. No gods, no purposes, no life after death, no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, no free will for humans either. Similarly, Richard Dawkins writes in A River Out of Eden, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, lest you accuse me of cherry-picking atheists who are lousy philosophers, here's Bertrand Russell. Brief and powerless is man's life. On him and all his race the slow, sure doom falls, pitiless and dark. Blind to good and evil, reckless of destruction, omnipotent matter rolls on its relentless way. J.L. Mackie, another 20th century atheist, denies the existence of objective moral values. This is something that for a lot of atheistic thinkers, yes, it follows from their atheism. Friedrich Nietzsche very famously said, if God is dead, there are no objective moral values and duties. In fact, there's no objective truth, period. C.S. Lewis notes, back a page, there we go. C.S. Lewis notes that these considerations were partially responsible for him rejecting the atheism he had embraced as an Oxford professor. My argument against God, he says, was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Now, not all atheists, of course, agree that God is required to sustain the existence of objective moral values and duties. There's a veritable cottage industry of non-religious philosophers and other thinkers seeking alternative means of providing a foundation for objective moral truth. I was going to look at two. I'm going to cut one of them out in the interest of time, and we're just going to look at one, and that one really briefly. So let's look quickly at evolutionary ethics. According to evolutionary ethics, or sociobiology, or evolutionary psychology, lots of different names for it, morality develops as animals gain cognitive and relational capacities. Robert Trivers developed the notion of reciprocal altruism in the 1970s to describe why selfish creatures driven by evolutionary impulses would cooperate with other creatures, even when doing so seemed to jeopardize their own immediate self-interest. The idea, ably articulated also by E.O. Wilson and Richard Dawkins and others, is that, Richard Dawkins, he's so inconsistent, right? In River Out of Eden, there is no good or evil. This is what you expect in an atheistic universe. And then in the God delusion, like, oh yeah, atheism can sustain objective ethics. I'm like, okay, is it or is it not? I just don't know. I don't know what he thinks. I don't think he knows what he thinks, but that's okay. So the idea of reciprocal altruism is that in the long-term communal interests of species like human beings, it's in our best interests to work together, to trust one another, and to put others above oneself at times. For example, he says it's better as a whole for people to risk their lives running into burning buildings to save others. Why? Well, because somewhere down the road, you might be the one in the burning building needing somebody else to risk their life running in to save you. So you run in to try to save other people so that they'll run in to save you. By the same token, they say, well, okay, why do people our age care for young children and aging parents? Or why would we do that? Aging parents, after all, they're just going to die. They're not going to contribute anything more to society, right? So why take care of them? Why spoon feed them? Why do all of this? Well, they know what's going to happen to you. One day, you're going to be that elderly parent that needs care. And so if your children, your progeny, see you caring for your aging parents, and they remember that you cared for them when they were helpless, they will be more inclined to help you when you are helpless. And so that kind of long-term thinking, they say, drives this reciprocal altruism and makes us help others even when it's not in our immediate self-interest. As these types of reciprocal altruistic insights accumulate, human societies begin to codify these relationships into moral codes. Thou shalt honor thy father and mother. And it then goes better for society if these moral codes are enforced by some type of explicit or implicit moral police. Hence, the rise of religion. A father in the sky to enforce the moral code. Our moral values and duties then, they say, have evolved over time. The fundamental failure of evolutionary ethics is its inability to move beyond is to ought. At best, evolutionary ethicists can exhort us, encourage us to cooperate on the basis that this will achieve our own long-term benefit, and warn us that failing to cooperate may cost us in the long run. But sociobiology cannot tell us how we ought to act. Indeed, I think the enlightened elite in evolutionary ethics would be best advised to keep the masses uninformed so that they will adhere to some type of moral standard that ensures the preservation of the species while they live in accordance with their own selfish interests and desires. There's nothing transcendent, no transcendent ethic or standard which each of us is morally obligated to follow. Furthermore, what's the one consistent of evolution? Change. An objective standard, by definition, is the same for all people in all places at all times. And by definition, evolution is not that. So evolution is simply insufficient to ground an objective moral standard for moral values and duties. And alternative moral theories that are atheistic in nature suffer from the same fatal flaw. They fail to account for the real nature of the moral law. They fail to explain the existence of an objective external standard of right and wrong. If morality is an evolutionary product, then morality itself is subject to evolution. What is right today may be wrong tomorrow. What is wrong today may be right tomorrow. What is right for me may be wrong for somebody else who is either more highly evolved or closer to being an amoeba or a Calgarian or a Texan. Ethical standards are ultimately relative. There is no standard by which we may judge thoughts and actions. Indeed, an objective moral standard has to be, by definition, external to us. As such, it requires an external source, a moral source which is beyond, transcendent to our human existence. An objective moral standard requires something very much like our Christian understanding of God. There is no good without God. Alternative sources for universal objective moral values and duties are simply insufficient. Only God will do. Hence premise 3. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. So let's take stock of where that leaves us. Given atheism, it seems there is no problem of evil. If God does not exist, then the problem of evil cannot even get off the ground. Okay? The atheist premise, there is no God, right? So there is no God. Recall premise 3. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties. Hence, there is no objective standard for moral values and duties. Recall premise 2. If there is no objective standard for moral values and duties, then there is no objective evil. Therefore, since there's no objective standard for moral values and duties, there is no objective standard. There is no objective evil. Recall premise 1. If there is no objective evil, then there is no worldview problem of evil. Therefore, given that there is no objective evil, there is no worldview problem of evil. So when you combine the starting point, the intermediate steps, and the end point, you find that if God does not exist, then there simply is no worldview problem of evil. If God does not exist, there is no objective evil. We cannot call things objectively evil. We can say that there are things that we do not like, things that we would prefer did not happen to us or to others, but there is no problem of evil to begin with. Worldviews, including Christianity, then do not need to account for evil and suffering in the world. And indeed, this, I think, is what one should expect given atheism. Russell, Dawkins, Provine note, a universe without a superintending divine being would be expected to be a world without moral oughts, without objective moral values and duties, and hence without a problem of evil to begin with. But how did we get started on this whole journey in the first place? The Christian atheist debate began with the atheist accusation that evil serves as evidence against the existence of God. We noted that people of all worldviews recognize the reality of evil and suffering, the bad or negative states of affairs due to the wicked intentions or moral negligence on the part of free-willed moral agents. Atheists use these bad states of affairs to serve as Exhibit A against the existence of God. Hume, Mackey, Rowe insist that the existence or type of evil demonstrates that God cannot or most likely does not exist. But if the problem of evil does not exist, if God doesn't exist, then the problem of evil cannot be used as an argument against God's existence. It seems that the atheist is caught between a rock and a hard place. He can either maintain his belief in the existence of evil and abandon his objections against the existence of God, or he can maintain his rejection of God and abandon his belief in the existence of evil. Track both options quickly, and these ones are on the back as well. If God does not exist, then there is no problem of evil, right? This is the argument we just tracked through. So if the atheist wants to maintain his rejection of God's existence, he cannot complain about evil suffering in the world. What about going the other way around? Well, we start with the worldview recognition that evil exists and must be accounted for by any adequate worldview. We will find that if evil exists, God must also exist. We begin by recognizing that it is not the case that there is not a worldview problem of evil. That is, there is a problem of evil that all worldviews need to address. But remember premise 1 earlier, if there is no object of evil, then there is no problem of evil. By modus tollens, therefore, since there is a problem of evil, it is not the case that there is no object of evil. That is, object of evil exists. But remember premise 2 from earlier, if there's no objective standard for moral values and duties, then there is no object of evil. But it's not the case that there is no object of evil. Therefore, it's not the case that there is no objective standard for moral values and duties either. That is, there is an objective standard. Remember premise 3 from earlier. If there is no God, there is no objective standard for moral values and duties. Given that it's not the case, there's no standard, then it's not the case that there is no God. That is, God exists. In this way, I contend the existence of evil, the very problem of evil that atheists want to use against Christianity, serves more powerfully and successfully as an argument for God's existence. If real evil exists, as virtually all human beings acknowledge it does, then we are required to posit the existence of a transcendent, personal, moral, divine being who serves as the objective standard for moral values and duties. It is when that objective standard is violated that we are able to identify actions or states of affairs as objectively evil. And it's only by acknowledging these objectively evil actions or states of affairs that we can begin to face the worldview problem of evil. If there is a problem of evil, then there is a God. I think the atheist is stuck. So in conclusion, the existence of evil points to, not away from, God's existence. Given Christianity, encompassing the creation, fall, redemption, glorification, worldview narrative, evil and suffering are to be expected, they are explained, and they are redeemable. Given atheism, evil and suffering is either non-existent or inexplicable, and is certainly irredeemable. It is sadly and profoundly ironic to me that Bart Ehrman ends his book, God's Problem, his diatribe against biblical treatments of evil and suffering, by rejecting the existence of God and encouraging his readers to, I quote, alleviate suffering and bring hope to a world devoid of hope. Ehrman has been systematically rejecting the one transcendent eschatological source of hope available to human beings who are suffering temporal evils with no prospects for earthly remediation or redemption. It's only within Ehrman's worldview that the world is devoid of hope. Given a Christian worldview, the existence of a God who is both holy and transcendent, we can and should still seek, as Ehrman encourages, to alleviate suffering. But we can also articulate a true and a meaningful hope, one that resonates and continues to resonate with human beings across civilizations. Does evil exist? Is there a worldview problem of evil? I think it does, and I think there is. If so, my contention is that the acknowledgement of real evil and suffering in the world serves as an argument for, not against, the existence of God. So the next time you hear an atheist talk about the problem of evil, perhaps just ask the question, whose problem is this? Thank you. Is there time for questions? Okay. But only easy questions? No hard questions, okay?
All right, speak into the microphone.
Thank you. One of the things I found is talking to people who don't believe is making that jump that you made. It seemed like you made a jump a little bit from that there is an objective evil, therefore there has to be a God. And you didn't quite that abrupt, but most of the time when I talk to people about that, they go, how do you know what's right or wrong? You try to have that discussion. How do you know that something's right or wrong?
Yeah.
And you can use genocide,
Mm-hmm.
so we agree that's bad. But you try to get into more marginal cases. But most of the time they'll just say, well, I just know that's wrong.
Yeah.
I just know. Well, how do you know? Well, I have to know that's wrong. And you can't really get past that in a discussion because they just know.
That's good, yeah.
You agree they're right.
Yeah.
It kind of, it seems to me
Right.
that you went to that, you don't ever get to that point I think that you were making about being objective wrong.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and you're right. I mean, oftentimes, so we want to press and ask the question, okay, on what grounds are you saying that this is wrong? Okay, so me and my, say, an agnostic or unbelieving relative, we can have a conversation. We can both acknowledge that, yeah, okay, this is wrong, and I want to ask, well, on what grounds do we call this wrong, right? Well, we just know that it's wrong, right? This is where, again, I think talking about the objectivity is important, right? Because if it's objectively evil, that means it's wrong for all people in all places at all times, right? And then again, the question is, well, on what basis do we say that, right? Because there are human beings who will disagree with us on anything that we can use as an example. If there is no objective standard, this is why this is the important intermediate step, right? If there is no objective standard for moral values and duties, then there is no objective evil. Even if everybody agrees, 100% of humans agree that X is wrong, if there's no objective standard for that, then this thing is not really wrong, right? Think of a quiz that a professor gives you, right? If there is no answer key, then anything goes, right? Any answer is acceptable unless there's a standard by which the quiz is being judged, right? So if there is no objective standard, then there is no objective evil. The difficulty I think that we find, and I mean I find this in conversations with my own family, right, is that God has built within us, right, Romans 2, God has built his moral law within our hearts. And so we know it even if we don't know how we know it. And even if somebody's worldview technically denies the existence of the object of evil that they know is evil, they still can't get away from the fact that they know it's evil. Because this is how God has made us. I think sometimes abductive reasoning with them can be helpful. Say, well, okay, you and I both know that this is evil, and maybe we're having a hard time explaining why it's evil. Let's just consider some possible worldview explanations for why we consider this thing to be evil. Here's what a Buddhist worldview would say. Here's what a naturalistic worldview would say. Here's what a Christian worldview would say. Which one seems to give the most satisfactory answer for why we agree that this thing is evil? And maybe that helps a little bit. Good question.
When you were talking about ethical evolution, right?
Yeah. Or evolutionary ethics, sociobiology, all sorts of different names for it. Yeah.
Okay, you said that it kind of doesn't make sense because the whole evolution of the world has changed,
Mm-hmm.
and our objective standard doesn't change.
Right.
How would you respond if an atheist disagreed with you and said that our objective standard does need to change a little bit, hence transgender and
Yeah. Excellent question, right? I would respond by just asking, what do we mean by objective? Right. When we talk about objective truth or an objective moral standard, how we typically define that in philosophical terms is that it's the same for all people in all places at all times, right? So there's an objective truth to the question, what's 2 + 2? The answer is 4, and that holds for all people in all places at all times. Yes, comp sci guys, base 3, blah, 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 okay? But 2 + 2 = 4 is objectively true. And so if it's an objective standard, again, definition of terms is essential. If it's an objective moral standard, then by definition it doesn't change for different people in different places and different times. And so if we're going to argue that, okay, well, no, I think that our standard, we have a societal standard for what is right and wrong, but that standard needs to change and adjust according to time periods, which is very much where North Americans are, right? You guys are about 15, 20 years behind where Canada is on that, not to our credit necessarily, right? If you're going to argue that the societal standard needs to change over time, then what you're simply saying is that that standard is not objective, right? It's not the same for all people in all places at all times, right? And so it's just not an objective standard. Things aren't objectively wrong by that standard. Things are just wrong for these people in this place at this time, and they may not be considered wrong next year or 2 years or 10 years or 20 years down the road. It was profoundly interesting, right, that when Barack Obama was elected president, he swore up and down marriage is between a man and a woman, between a man and a woman, and within 8 years, right, before the end of his presidency, this will be his lasting legacy, that his understanding of marriage changed, and there was an earthquake in terms of the moral fabric of American society, where this becomes the accepted standard, right? Now, what that shows me is that his understanding of what marriage is not an objective standard, because objective would mean it's the same for all people in all places at all times, and his wasn't even true for him in 6 years apart. Does that kind of help? But that's one of the most frequent things that you're going to hear, is that, okay, no, we have an objective standard, it just changes over time. We need to take more philosophy, right? That's fair to say, right? That when we say something's objective, it's unchanging. Good.
Thanks for being here, Dr. Anderson.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here.
I had two questions, if I could just briefly ask. I heard in your presentation the standard moral argument for Dr. Business. And the second premise is that just simply that objective morals and values do exist.
Yeah.
I have personally found it to be very effective to defend that premise with the Flanagan's reform of epistemology. Like, I know that objective moral values do exist because I have personal experience with them. In the same way that I trust my sensory perceptions to tell me that the external world is real, I trust my moral experience to tell me that right and wrong is the right thing.
Okay.
So my first question is, do you find that to be a sufficient answer to that question? And then secondly, has tacitly to do with the topic, because I heard the free will defense come up. Sam Harris uses I don't know the technical name for the argument, but I guess I'll call it the influence argument, that you don't have free will.
Yeah.
You have influences around you in the external world that show that, and that's supposed to be a way of saying you only do this because of this influence, and then you do this because of that influence. It's not that you're actually given a choice. And for me personally, I found the reformed epistemological approach to this to be really effective as well. That, first of all, when he makes that kind of claim, he's not actually stating, all he's saying is that there are influences, and then making a leap of faith into that, that's all there is. It's not
Right.
actually showing that those influences are the
Determining
only
factors. Yeah.
determining factors.
Yeah.
And so my place to that is stating that first of all, and then second of all, that I have an experience as well. And so in the absence of any kind of
Right.
competing arguments to that, I'm perfectly rational to accept that I'm making my choices as my own volition. So I was wondering, how would you respond to that if someone was to pose that kind of argument that you only do what you do due to your external influences?
But the answer to the first question is yes. And to the second question, I hope I'd be able to put it the way you just put it, because I thought that was really good. So I'd hope that I'd remember your words and be able to use them in that situation. And because I do think that Sam Harris, in a sense, is trying to have his cake and eat it too, right? That he's saying, okay, we don't have libertarian free will. There's just influences, and we deal with things. But nonetheless, we need to choose to do the good things, right? So you've got the moral landscape, and then I forget the little book on free will that he writes right after it. And I'm kind of like, okay, given this falsifies everything that you wrote in that. So yeah, no, I just think that's really well put. Thank you.